You fool! Warren is dead.
The Worm and Others. 5 stories by David H. Keller. The Worm. 1. The miller patted his dog on the head as he whispered, "We're going to stay here. Our folks, your ancestors and mine, have been here for nearly 200 years, and queer it would be to leave now because of fear." The grist mill stood, a solid stone structure, in an isolated Vermont valley. Years ago, every day had been a busy one for the mill and the miller, but now only the mill wheel was busy. There was no grist for the mill, and no one lived in the valley. Blackberries and hazel grew, where once the pastures had been green. The hand of time had passed over the farms, and the only folk left were sleeping in the churchyard. A family of squirrels nested in the pulpit, while on the tombstones silent snails left their cryptic messages in silvery streaks. Thompson's Valley was being handed back to nature. Only the old bachelor miller, John Staples, remained. He was too proud and too stubborn to do anything else. The mill was his home, even as it had served all of his family for a home during the last 200 years. The first Staples had built it to stay, and it was still as strong as on the day it was finished. There was a basement for the machinery of the mill. The first floor was the place of grinding and storage, and the upper 2 floors served as the Staples homestead. The building was warm in winter and cool in summer. Times past it had sheltered a dozen Staples at a time. Now it provided a home for John Staples and his dog. He lived there with his books and his memories. He had no friends and desired no associates. Once a year, he went to the nearest town and bought supplies of all kinds, paying for them in gold. It was supposed that he was wealthy. Rumor credited him with being a miser. He attended to his own business, asked the world to do the same, and on a winter's evening laughed silently over Burton and Rabelais, while his dog chased rabbits in his heated sleep upon the hearth. The winter of 1935 was beginning to threaten the valley, but with an abundance of food and wood in the mill, the recluse looked forward to a comfortable period of desuetude. No matter how cold the weather, he was warm and contented. With the inherent ability of his family, he had been able to convert the water power into electricity. When the wheel was frozen, he used the electricity stored in his storage batteries. Every day he puttered around among the machinery which it was his pride to keep in perfect order. He assured the dog that if business ever did come to the mill, he would be ready for it. It was on Christmas Day of that winter that he first heard the noise. Going down to the basement to see that nothing had been injured by the bitter freeze of the night before, his attention was attracted, even while descending the stone steps, by a peculiar grinding noise that seemed to come from out of the ground. His ancestors, building for permanency, had not only put in solid foundations, but had paved the entire basement with slate flagstones 3 feet wide and as many inches thick. Between these, the dust of 2 centuries had gathered and hardened. Once his feet were on this pavement, Staples found that he could not only hear the noise, but he could also feel the vibrations which accompanied it through the flagstones. Even through his heavy leather boots he could feel the rhythmic pulsations. Pulling off his mittens, he stooped over and put his fingertips on the stone. To his surprise, it was warm in spite of the fact that the temperature had been below 0 the night before. The vibration was more distinct to his fingertips than it had been to his feet. Puzzled, he threw himself on the slate stone and put his ear to the warm surface. The sound he now heard made him think of the grinding of the millstones when he was a boy, and the farmers had brought corn to be ground into meal. There had been no cornmeal ground in the mill for 50 years, yet here was the sound of stone scraping slowly and regularly on stone. He could not understand it. In fact, it was some time before he tried to explain it. With a habit born of years of solitary thinking, he first collected all the available facts about this noise. He knew that during the long winter evenings he would have time enough to do his thinking. Going to his sitting room, he secured a walking stick of ash and went back to the cellar. Holding the handle of the cane lightly, he placed the other end on 100 different spots on the floor, and each time he held it long enough to determine the presence or absence of vibration. To his surprise, he found that while it varied in strength, it was present all over the cellar with the exception of the 4 corners. The maximum intensity was about in the center. That evening he concentrated on the problem before him. He had been told by his grandfather that the mill was built on solid rock. As a young man, he had helped clean out a well near the mill, and recalled that instead of being dug out of gravel or dirt, it had the appearance of being drilled out of solid granite. There was no difficulty in believing that the earth under the mill was also solid rock. There was no reason for thinking otherwise. Evidently, some of these strata of stone had become loose and were slipping and twisting under the mill. The simplest explanation was the most reasonable. It was simply a geological phenomenon. The behavior of the dog, however, was not so easily explained. He had refused to go with his master into the cellar, and now, instead of sleeping in comfort before the fire, he was in an attitude of strained expectancy. He did not bark or even whine, but crept silently to his master's chair, looking at him anxiously. The next morning the noise was louder. Staples heard it in his bed, and at first he thought that some bold adventurer had come into the forest and was sawing down a tree. That was what it sounded like, only softer and longer in its rhythm. Buzz, buzz, buzz. The dog, distinctly unhappy, jumped up on the bed and crawled uneasily so he could nuzzle the man's hand. Through the 4 legs of the bed, Staples could feel the same vibration that had come to him through the handle of his cane the day before. That made him think. The vibration was now powerful enough to be appreciated not through a walking stick, but through the walls of the building. The noise could be heard as well on the 3rd floor as in the cellar. He tried to fancy what it sounded like, not what it was, but what it was like. The first idea had been that it resembled a saw going through oak. Then came the thought of bees swarming, only these were large bees and millions of them. But finally all he could think of was the grinding of stones in a grist mill, the upper stone against the lower, and now the sound was grrr, grrr, instead of buzz or hum. That morning, he took longer than usual to shave, and was more methodical than was his wont in preparing breakfast for himself and the dog. It seemed as though he knew that some time he would have to go down into the cellar, but wanted to postpone it as long as he could. In fact, he finally put on his coat and beaver hat and mittens and walked outdoors before he went to the basement. Followed by the dog, who seemed happy for the first time in hours, he walked out on the frozen ground and made a circle around the building he called his home. Without knowing it, he was trying to get away from the noise, to go somewhere he could walk without feeling that peculiar tingling. Finally, he went into the mill and started down the steps to the cellar. The dog hesitated on the top step, went down 2 steps, and then jumped back to the top step, where he started to whine. Staples went steadily down the steps, but the dog's behavior did not add to his peace of mind. The noise was much louder than it was the day before, and he did not need a cane to detect the vibration. The whole building was shaking. He sat down on the 3rd step from the bottom and thought the problem over before he ventured out on the floor. He was especially interested in an empty barrel which was dancing around the middle of the floor. The power of the mill wheel was transferred through a simple series of shafts, cogs, and leather belting to the grinding elements on the 1st floor. All this machinery for transmitting power was in the basement. The actual grinding had been done on the first floor. The weight of all this machinery, as well as of the heavy millstones on the first floor, was carried entirely by the flooring of the basement. The ceiling of the first floor was built on long pine beams which stretched across the entire building and were sunk into the stone walls at either side. Staple started to walk around on the slate flagstones when he observed something that made him decide to stay on the steps. The floor was beginning to sink in the middle, not much, but enough to cause some of the shafts to separate from the ceiling. The ceiling seemed to sag. He saw that light objects like the empty barrel were congregating at the middle of the cellar. There was not much light, but he was easily able to see that the floor was no longer level, that it was becoming saucer-shaped. The grinding noise grew louder. The steps he sat on were of solid masonry, stoutly connected with and a part of the wall. These shared in the general vibration. The whole building began to sing like a cello. One day he had been to the city and heard an orchestra play. He had been interested in the large violins, especially the one that was so large the player had to stay on his feet to play it. The feeling of the stone step under him reminded him of the notes of this violin the few times it had been played by itself. He sat there. Suddenly he started, realizing that in a few more minutes he would be asleep. He was not frightened, but in some dim way he knew that he must not go to sleep, not here. Whistling, he ran up the steps to get his electric torch. With that in his hand, he went back to the steps. Aided by the steady light, he saw that several large cracks had appeared in the floor, and that some of the stones, broken loose from their fellows, were moving slowly in a drunken, meaningless way. He looked at his watch. It was only a little after 9. And then the noise stopped. No more noise, no more vibration, just a broken floor and every bit of the machinery of the mill disabled and twisted. In the middle of the floor was a hole where one of the pavement stones had dropped through. Staples carefully walked across and threw the light down this hole. Then he lay down and carefully put himself in such a position that he could look down the hole. He began to sweat. There did not seem to be any bottom. Back on the solid steps, he tried to give that hole its proper value. He could not understand it, but he did not need the whining of the dog to tell him what to do. That door must be closed as soon as possible. Like a flash, the method of doing so came to him. On the floor above, he had cement. There were hundreds of grain sacks. Water was plentiful in the mill race. All that day he worked, carefully closing the hole with a great stopper of bags and wire. Then he placed timbers above and finally covered it all with cement, rich cement. Night came, and he still worked. Morning came, and still he staggered down the steps, each time with a bag of crushed stone or cement on his shoulder, or with 2 buckets of water in his hands. At noon the next day, the floor was no longer concave, but convex. On top of the hole was 4 feet of timbers, bags, and concrete. Then and only then did he go and make some coffee. He drank it, cup after cup, and slept. The dog stayed on the bed at his feet. When the man awoke, the sun was streaming in through the windows. It was a new day. Though the fire had long since died out, the room was warm. Such days in Vermont were called weather breeders. Staples listened. There was no sound except the ticking of his clock. Not realizing what he was doing, he knelt by the bed, thanked God for his mercies, jumped into bed again, and slept for another 24 hours. This time he awoke and listened. There was no noise. He was sure that by this time the cement had hardened. This morning he stayed awake and shared a gargantuan meal with the dog. Then it seemed the proper thing to go to the basement. There was no doubt that the machinery was a wreck, but the hole was closed. Satisfied that the trouble was over, he took his gun and dog and went hunting. When he returned, he did not have to enter the mill to know that the grinding had begun again. Even before he started down the steps, he recognized too well the vibration and the sound. This time it was a melody of notes, a harmony of discords, and he realized that the thing, which before had cut through solid rock, was now wearing its way through a cement in which were bags, timbers, and pieces of iron. Each of these gave a different tone. Together they all wailed over their dissolution. Staples saw, even with the first glance, that it would not be long before his cement cork would be destroyed. What was there to do next? All that day when hunting, his mind had been dimly working on that problem. Now he had the answer. He could not cork the hole, so he would fill it with water. The walls of the mill were solid, but he could blast a hole through them and turn the mill race into the cellar. The race, fed by the river, took only a part of what it could take if its level were rapidly lowered. Whatever it was that was breaking down the floor of the mill could be drowned. If it were alive, it could be killed. If it was fire, it could be quenched. There was no use to wait until the hole was again opened. The best plan was to have everything ready. He went back to his kitchen and cooked a meal of ham and eggs. He ate all he could. He boiled a pot of coffee. Then he started to work. The wall reached 3 feet down below the surface. A charge of powder, heavy enough to break through, would wreck the whole building, so he began to peck at the wall, like a bird pecking at a nut. First a period of drilling, and then a little powder and a muffled explosion. A few buckets of loosened rock, then some more drilling and another explosion. At last he knew that only a few inches of rock lay between the water and the cellar. All this time there had been a symphony of noises, a disharmony of sounds. The constant grinding came from the floor, interrupted with the sound of sledge or crowbar, dull explosion of powder and crashing of rock, fragments on the floor. Staples worked without stop, save to drink his coffee. The dog stood on the upper steps. Then, without warning, the whole floor caved in. Staples jumped to the steps. These held. On the first day there had been a hole a few feet wide. Now the opening nearly occupied the entire area of the floor. Staples, nauseated, looked down to the bottom. There, about 20 feet below him, a mass of rocks and timbers churned in a peculiar way, but all gradually disappeared in a second hole, 15 feet wide. Even as he looked, they all disappeared in this median hole. The opening he had been breaking in the wall was directly across from the steps. There was a charge of powder there, but no way of going across to light the fuse. Still, there was no time to lose, and he had to think fast. Running to the floor above, he picked up his rifle and went to the bottom of the steps. He was able to throw the beam from his searchlight directly into the hole in the wall. Then he shot, once, twice, and the third time the explosion told him he had succeeded. The water started to run into the cellar. Not fast at first, but more rapidly as the mud and weeds were cleared out. Finally, an 8-inch stream flowed steadily into the bottomless hole. Staples sat on the bottom steps. Soon he had the satisfaction of seeing the water fill the larger hole and then cover the floor, what there was left of it. In another hour he had to leave the lower steps. He went out to the mill race and saw that there was still enough water to fill 100 such holes. A deep sense of satisfaction filled his weary mind. And again, after eating, he sought sleep. 2. When he awoke, he heard the rain angrily tapping at the windows with multi-fingers. The dog was on the woven rug by the side of the bed. He was still restless and seemed pleased to have his master awake. Staples dressed more warmly than usual and spent an extra half-hour making pancakes to eat with honey. Sausages and coffee helped assuage his hunger. Then, with rubber boots and a heavy raincoat, he went out into the valley. The very first thing that he noticed was the mill race. It was practically empty. The little stream of water at the bottom was pouring into the hole he had blasted into the stone wall hours before. The race had contained 8 feet of water. Now barely 6 inches remained, and the dread came to the man that the hole in the cellar was not only emptying the race, but was also draining the little river that for thousands of years had flowed through the valley. It had never gone dry. He hastened over to the dam, and his worst fears were realized. Instead of a river, there was simply a streak of mud with cakes of dirty ice, all being washed by the torrent of rain. With relief he thought of this rain. Millions of tons of snow would melt and fill the river. Ultimately the hole would fill, and the water would rise again in the mill race. Still he was uneasy. What if the hole had no bottom? When he looked into the basement, he was little reassured. The water was still going down, though slowly. It was rising in the basement, and this meant that it was now running in faster than it was running down. Leaving his coat and boots on the first floor, he ran up the stone steps to the second floor, built a fire in the living room, and started to smoke and think. The machinery of the mill was in ruins. Of course it could be fixed, but as there was no more need of it, the best thing was to leave it alone. He had gold saved by his ancestors. He did not know how much, but he could live on it. Restlessly, he reviewed the past week and, unable to rest, hunted for occupation. The idea of the gold stayed in his mind, and the final result was that he again put on his boots and coat and carried the entire treasure to a little dry cave in the woods, about a half-mile from the mill. Then he came back and started to cook his dinner. He went past the cellar door 3 times without looking down. Just as he and the dog had finished eating, he heard a noise. It was a different one this time, more like a saw going through wood, but the rhythm was the same. Hurr, hurr. He started to go to the cellar, but this time he took his rifle, and while the dog went after him, he howled dismally with his tail between his legs, shivering. As soon as Staples reached the first floor, he felt the vibration. Not only could he feel the vibration, he could see it. It seemed that the center of the floor was being pushed up. Flashlight in hand, he opened the cellar door. There was no water there now. In fact, there was no cellar left. In front of him was a black wall on which the light played in undulating waves. It was a wall, and it was moving. He touched it with the end of his rifle. It was hard, and yet there was a give to it. Feeling the rock, he could feel it move. Was it alive? Could there be a living rock? He could not see around it, but he felt that the bulk of the thing filled the entire cellar and was pressing against the ceiling. That was it. The thing was boring through the first floor. It had destroyed and filled the cellar. It had swallowed the river. Now it was working at the first floor. If this continued, the mill was doomed. Staples knew that it was a thing alive, and he had to stop it. He was thankful that all of the steps in the mill were of stone, fastened and built into the wall. Even though the floor did fall in, he could still go to the upper rooms. He realized that from now on the fight had to be waged from the top floors. Going up the steps, he saw that a small hole had been cut through the oak flooring. Even as he watched, this grew larger. Trying to remain calm, realizing that only by doing so could he retain his sanity, he sat down in a chair and timed the rate of enlargement. But there was no need of using a watch. The hole grew larger and larger and larger, and now he began to see the dark hole which had sucked the river dry. Now it was 3 feet in diameter, now 4 feet, now 6. It was working smoothly now. It was not only grinding, but it was eating. Staples began to laugh. He wanted to see what it would do when the big stone grinder slipped silently down into that moor. That would be a rare sight. All well enough to swallow a few pavement stones, but when it came to a 20-ton grinder, that would be a different kind of a pill. "I hope you choke," he cried. "Damn you, whatever you are. I hope you choke." The walls held back the echo of his shouts and frightened him into silence. Then the floor began to tilt, and the chair to slide toward the opening. Staples sprang toward the steps. "Not yet," he shrieked. "Not today, Eleanor. Some other day, but not today." And then from the safety of the steps he witnessed the final destruction of that floor and all in it. The stones slipped down, the partitions, the beams, and then, as though satisfied with the work and the food, the thing dropped down, 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 and left Staples dizzy on the steps, looking into a hole, dark, deep, coldly bottomless, surrounded by the walls of the mill, and below them a circular hole cut out of the solid rock. On one side a little stream of water came through the blasted wall and fell, a tiny waterfall, below. Staples could not hear it splash at the bottom. Nauseated and vomiting, he crept up the steps to the second floor, where the howling dog was waiting for him. On the floor he lay, sweating and shivering in dumb misery. It took hours for him to change from a frightened animal to a cerebrating god, but ultimately he accomplished even this, cooked some more food, warmed himself, and slept. And while he dreamed, the dog kept sleepless watch at his feet. He awoke the next morning. It was still raining, and Staples knew that the snow was melting on the hills and soon would change the little valley river into a torrent. He wondered whether it was all a dream, but one look at the dog showed him the reality of the last week. He went to the second floor again and cooked breakfast. After he had eaten, he slowly went down the steps. That is, he started to go, but halted at the sight of the hole. The steps had held and ended on a wide stone platform. From there another flight of steps went down to what had once been the cellar. These two flights of steps clinging to the walls had the solid stone mill on one side, but on the inside they faced a chasm, circular in outline and seemingly bottomless. But the man knew there was a bottom, and from that pit the thing had come, and would come again. That was the horror of it. He was so certain that it would come again. Unless he was able to stop it. How could he? Could he destroy a thing that was able to bore a 30-foot hole through solid rock, swallow a river, and digest grinding stones like so many pills? One thing he was sure of. He could accomplish nothing without knowing more about it. To know more, he had to watch. He determined to cut a hole through the floor. Then he could see the thing when it came up. He cursed himself for his confidence, but he was sure it would come. It did. He was on the floor looking into the hole he had sawed through the plank, and he saw it come. But first he heard it. It was a sound full of slithering slidings, wrathful rasping of rock against rock. But no, that could not be, for this thing was alive. Could this be rock and move and grind and eat and drink? Then he saw it come into the cellar and finally to the level of the first floor, and then he saw its head and face. The face looked at the man, and Staples was glad that the hole in the floor was as small as it was. There was a central mouth filling half the space. Fully 15 feet in diameter was that mouth, and the sides were ashen grey and quivering. There were no teeth. That increased the horror. A mouth without teeth, without any visible means of mastication, and yet Staples shivered as he thought of what had gone into that mouth, down into that mouth, deep into the recesses of that mouth, and disappeared. The circular lips seemed made of scales of steel, and they were washed clean with the water from the race. On either side of this gigantic mouth was an eye, lidless, browless, pitiless. They were slightly withdrawn into the head, so the thing could bore into rock without injuring them. Staples tried to estimate their size. All he could do was to avoid their baleful gaze. Then, even as he watched, the mouth closed and the head began a semicircular movement, so many degrees to the right, so many degrees to the left, and up, and finally the top touched the bottom of the plank Staples was on, and then hurr, and the man knew that it was starting upon the destruction of the second floor. He could not see now, as he had been able to see before, but he had an idea that after grinding a while, the thing opened its mouth and swallowed the debris. He looked around the room. Here was where he did his cooking and washing, and Here was his winter supply of stove wood. A thought came to him. Working frantically, he pushed the center burner to the middle of the room, right over the hole he had cut in the floor. Then he built a fire in it, starting it with a liberal supply of coal oil. He soon had the stove red hot. Opening the door, he again filled the stove with oak and then ran for the steps. He was just in time. The floor, cut through, disappeared into the thing's maw, and with it the red-hot stove. Staples yelled in his glee, "A hot pill for you this time! A hot pill!" If the pill did anything, it simply increased the desire of the thing to destroy, for it kept on till it had bored a hole in this floor equal in size to the holes in the floors below it. Staples saw his food, his furniture, the ancestral relics disappear into the same opening that had consumed the machinery and mill supplies. On the upper floor the dog howled. The man slowly went up to the top floor and joined the dog, who had ceased to howl, and began an uneasy whine. There was a stove on this floor, but there was no food. That did not make any difference to Staples. For some reason he was not hungry any more. It did not seem to make any difference. Nothing seemed to matter or make any difference any more. Still, he had his gun and over 50 cartridges, and he knew that at the last even a thing like that would react to bullets in its eyeballs. He just knew that nothing could withstand that. He lit the lamp and paced the floor in a cold, careless mood. One thing he had determined. He said it over and over to himself. "This is my home. It has been the home of my family for 200 years. No devil or beast or worm can make me leave it." He said it again and again. He felt that if he said it often enough, he would believe it. And if he could only believe it, he might make the worm believe it. He knew now that it was a worm, just like the night crawlers he had used so often for bait, only much larger. Yes, that was it. A worm like a night crawler, only much larger, in fact, very much larger. That made him laugh, to think how much larger this worm was than the ones he had used for fishing. All through the night he walked the floor and burned the lamp and said, "This is my home. No worm can make me leave it." Several times he went down the steps, just a few of them, and shouted the message into the pit as though he wanted the worm to hear and understand. "This is my home. No worm can make me leave it." Morning came. He mounted the ladder that led to the trapdoor in the roof and opened it. The rain beat in. Still, that might be a place of refuge. Crying, he took his Burton and his Rabelais and wrapped them in his raincoat and put them out on the roof under a box. He took the small pictures of his father and mother and put them with the books. Then, in loving kindness, he carried the dog up and wrapped him in a woolen blanket. He sat down and waited, and as he did so, he recited poetry. Anything that came to him, all mixed up. Come into the garden where there was a man who was so wondrous wise. He jumped into a bramble bush, and you're a better man than I am, and no one will work for money, and the king of love my shepherd is, and on. And then he heard the sliding and the slithering rasping, and he knew that the worm had come again. He waited till the hurr told that the wooden floor he was on was being attacked, and then he went up the ladder. It was his idea to wait till the thing had made a large opening, large enough so the eyes could be seen, and then use the 50 bullets, where they would do the most good. So, on the roof beside the dog, he waited. He did not have to wait long. First appeared a little hole, and then it grew wider and wider, till finally the entire floor and the furniture had dropped into the mouth, and the whole opening, 30 feet wide and more than that, was filled with the head, the closed mouth of which came within a few feet of the roof. By the aid of the light from the trapdoor, Staples could see the eye on the left side. It made a beautiful bullseye, a magnificent target for his rifle, and he was only a few feet away. He could not miss. Determined to make the most of his last chance to drive his enemy away, he decided to drop down on the creature, walk over to the eye, and put the end of the rifle against the eye, before he fired. If the first shot worked well, he could retire to the roof and use the other cartridges. He knew that there was some danger, but it was his last hope. After all, he knew that when it came to brains, he was a man, and this thing was only a worm. He walked over the head. Surely no sensation could go through such massive scales. He even jumped up and down. Meantime, the eye kept looking up at the roof. If it saw the man, it made no signs, gave no evidence. Staples pretended to pull the trigger, and then made a running jump for the trapdoor. It was easy. He did it again and again. Then he sat on the edge of the door and thought. He suddenly saw what it all meant. 200 years before, his ancestors had started grinding at the mill. For over 150 years, the mill had been run continuously, often day and night. The vibrations had been transmitted downward through the solid rock. Hundreds of feet below, the worm had heard them, and felt them, and thought it was another worm. It had started to bore in the direction of the noise. It had taken 200 years to do it, but it had finished the task. It had found the place where its mate should be. For 200 years it had slowly worked its way through the primitive rock. Why should it worry over a mill and the things within it? Staples saw then that the mill had been but a slight incident in its life. It was probable that it had not even known it was there. The water, the grist millstones, the red-hot stove had meant nothing. They had been taken as a part of the day's work. There was only one thing that the worm was really interested in, but one idea that had reached its consciousness and remained there through 2 centuries, and that was to find its mate. The eye looked upward. Staples, at the end, lost courage and decided to fire from a sitting position in the trapdoor. Taking careful aim, he pulled the trigger. Then he looked carefully to see what damage had resulted. There was none. Either the bullet had gone into the eye and the opening had closed, or else it had glanced off. He fired again and again. Then the mouth opened, wide, wider, until there was nothing under Staples save a yawning void of darkness. The worm belched a cloud of black and nauseating vapor. The man, enveloped in the cloud, lost consciousness and fell. The mouth closed on him. On the roof, the dog howled. Death of the Kraken. "Brother, can you spare a dime?" the man asked me in the low monotone used by the chronic panhandler. "No money," I replied, "but I will give you a good meal and something to drink." I took him to a chop house. From the way he ate, there was no doubt of his hunger. It seemed that he never would be satisfied. Finally he finished, emptied his glass of beer, and accepted a cigarette. He looked across the table at me. "That is the first meal I have had for 2 days," he said. "And what do you do for a living that makes you want to feed a man like me?" "I write for a living," I answered, with a little twisted smile. "And sometimes I sell what I write, and sometimes I fail to. When my brain gets dull, I hunt up a man like you, and he tells me a story." "So you want a story to pay for the meal?" "If you have one and want to tell it to me. But you do not really owe me anything. I was amply repaid by your enjoyment of the food. Ever hear of the Sargasso Sea?" "Sure. For some thousands of years, every traveler has told about it. Maundeville described it. Columbus sailed through it. Oviedo gave it a name from Sargasso, the Portuguese word for seaweed. Drake sailed through it for 5 days. The scientist Humboldt described it. What do you know about it?" "Not much, but I have been there." "No story in that. Thousands have been there. Used to be a place of mystery, port of lost ships caught in the weeds and rotting till they sunk. But those old stories were based on fancy. Simply a lot of weeds there, mainly the Sargasso bacciferum and ocean trash carried by the Gulf Stream. The old tales of prisoned ships and sea monsters were just the imagination of frightened seamen whose memory became more vivid with every drink of rum. Then no matter what I tell you, you will not believe me? What difference does that make so long as I listen? Have a drink? Yes, another beer. Now, in regard to the story. I was loafing one day in the lobby of a cheap hotel here in New York, wondering how much longer I could go without food, when up comes a man and asks if I want a job. We started to talk, and it seemed that he wanted a man who could handle a machine gun, or even something bigger. That was right in my line. Yes, sir. When it comes to machine guns, I know what I'm doing. I have used them in a dozen wars, from a half-pint revolution in South America to real fighting in the World War. Of course, I did not know where he was going to take me in the gun, but a job just then looked rather good to me. It turned out that it was not a real fight he was financing, but a sea voyage. He was interested in this Sargasso Sea, had an idea that everything the old travellers wrote about it was not so much imagination, told me that there must be some part of their story true, and he was going to find out. Had his ship and crew and only lacked a gunner. What do you want a machine gun for? I asked him. He tried to explain it to me. He said he had been working on the trip for years, and had read everything he could put his hands on. All the tales of the old travellers, starting in with a Greek called Plato. I happen to remember that name because he called the old cat on the ship Plato. Then he went on to say that one part of the story, which was repeated again and again, had to do with sea monsters that picked the sailors off the ships and ate them, and if anything like that happened to us, a machine gun would come in handy. I signed for the trip. Of course, I did not believe his story about those sea monsters, thought he was starting a little private war or something, but the wages were good, and when I saw his ship, I knew the eating was going to be good. That man Ferguson was certainly a real man, and he tried his best to make the crew have a comfortable time. His ship had made several voyages north, and it sure was stoutly built. Sails when there was a wind, and an oil-burning engine to use in the calm. There were 8 of us aboard, the captain, 4 sailors, the cook, Ferguson, and myself. Second day out of New York, he explained his plan to us. Once in the Gulf Stream, he was going to drift. If his idea was right, the ship would finally find its way right into the middle of this Sargasso Sea, and he claimed that there was no telling what we would find there, because for some hundreds of years all the ships had tried their best to keep away from this center, instead of hunting for it. "Have another glass of beer," I suggested. "You are telling a good story, and another drink will help you make it better." "No, I will wait till I finish." We sailed on for about a week, and finally get to the place where the captain thinks we can start drifting, and that is what we do. On the 3rd day, we see some weeds, and in a week the whole ocean is covered with them. From then on, the ship went slower and slower. Some days, for several hours at a time, it hardly seemed to move at all. Ferguson was having the time of his life studying the weeds and the little fish that lived among them. He would talk to us every night about the new discoveries of the day. One night, he showed us a fish that had legs on it instead of fins, and toes on the end of the legs. Every time he found a new fish, he would put it in a glass jar with alcohol to pickle it. Happy as a boy with a new toy. Of course, the life was slow for the rest of us, but he was the boss, and our pay was good, and we sort of jollied him along. "And how soon did you meet the first wreck?" I asked. He laughed. "We actually did see them. 5 in one day when we came into the dead center of the sea. By that time the weeds made a mat that in some places was over 5 feet deep. It almost looked as though a man could walk on it, and here and there a ship silently rotting and almost covered with barnacles and weeds. In 3 days we visited 7 of them, and the night of the 3rd day Ferguson asked me to have a talk with him in his cabin. He asked me if I had noticed anything peculiar about those 7 ships. Of course, I told him that they were all old, but what he wanted me to say was that there were no bones on any of them. I laughed at him when he said that. Bones? Of course not. Those old ships got stuck in the weeds, and when the crews found out that they were not going to get out of the weeds any other way, they provisioned boats and tried to get out to open water. Ferguson did not see it that way. You see, he still had the idea that some kind of animal had eaten those sailors before they had time to either escape or starve to death. Then he asked me to have the gun ready, because there was just a chance that this animal would come after us. Of course, he was the boss, and I was there to obey him. So I humored him and asked him just what kind of an animal he thought was going to eat us, because I wanted to know how to mount the gun and where to shoot at it. "Wait a minute," I said, interrupting him. "Let me tell you what Ferguson told you. I have read a great many of those old tales. Ferguson had nothing else to go by except those stories. He put them all together, and from them made a composite animal. It had a body about 30 feet long, 4 legs, and a tail. The neck was as long as the body, ending in a head big as a barrel with large eyes as big as dinner plates. There are whiskers about 3 feet long. It could swallow a man with one gulp. How's that? Anything like what Ferguson told you?" "Just about right. Of course, I thought he was daffy to even think there could be such a creature. But if he was willing to pretend there was one, I was willing to string along with him. We talked it over, and decided that the only way to kill anything like that was to put a dozen bullets into the brain, through the eyes, or the open mouth. And that would take some clever shooting, because that critter was not going to hold its head still when he was charging on the ship. The next morning I got the gun out and put it together and fired a few practice shots. That was sure a sweet gun, and worked as easy as a sewing machine. If you moved it slowly, you could cut a tree down with the bullets. Some of the crew asked me what it was for, but I didn't tell them about the idea Ferguson had. What was the use? I knew there wasn't any such animal. That next night, the night after I put the gun on deck, 2 of the crew who had been on deck duty disappeared. Just dropped out of the picture. Not a drop of blood, not a sound of pain or fear. On the deck at early dawn, off the deck at sunrise, nothing to explain it. Ferguson listened to the captain's report and made no comments. He simply went ahead with his study of the little fishes. The captain rested all that day, and the next night he stayed on the deck till morning, while the 2 sailors took alternate watches. Nothing happened, and nothing unusually different for another night. Then on the 3rd night, morning came, and the captain and one of the sailors were gone. Sounds rather silly to put it that way, to simply say they were gone. That left 4 of us, the cook, 1 sailor, Ferguson, and myself. I talked it over with the sailor, and then I went and told the boss that the best thing to do would be to get the engine started if we could, and get out of there while the getting was good. But he said no. If those men had been eaten by that animal, sea monster or Kraken or whatever I wanted to call it, it was up to me to kill it, and that was why he had brought me along with the crew. I told him I would take a chance at killing anything in the daytime, but what chance was there hitting it at night, when it attacked us so silently that there was no alarm given by the 1 sailor who had escaped? "Your story is getting good," I commented. "You bet it is. And now listen to this." The cook was a rather old man, and he was just plain jittery, drunk much of the time, and trembled like a leaf when he had to go on deck, even in the daytime. The next night, the 3 of us were in the cabin waiting for supper. Of course, we were not supposed to eat together. Not the best of discipline on a ship to have the crew eat with the master. But Ferguson thought it would make things easier for the cook. So we were waiting and wondering why the cook was late bringing the food. Ferguson said he was going to see what was the matter, and he left the cabin. And when he came back, he simply said that the cook was gone. The 3 of us hunted all over the ship, but we never found him. There was a tray of spilled food on the deck. He must have been carrying it to us when he was caught. At least that was the way Ferguson figured it out. "That is the only plausible explanation," I said. "Sure it is." Now, that left 3 of us. I made up my mind to trick that monster. Told Ferguson about my plan, and he thought it pretty good. We made a dummy out of some old sails and smeared it all over with lard to make it smell, and then we put that dummy up near the mast with a lantern near him, and I trained the gun so it would spray the bullets about 4 feet over his head, and I was going to stay there, and when the monster dove for him, I would start shooting. Ferguson and the sailor were going to stay on deck, but at the other end of the ship. Nothing happened. Not a thing. Toward morning, the boss came up and said he was going down and get some sleep. At sunup, I decided to get something to eat and try to sleep. Not that I felt sleepy, you understand, because my nerves were jumpy, but it seemed that if I had to go through another night of watching, I just had to sleep. And when I was drinking my coffee, it just occurred to me that I had not seen the sailor. I hunted for him, could not find him, and then woke Ferguson. All he knew was that the sailor had been on deck when he had gone to his cabin. We talked it over, and decided that while I was watching that dummy, the damn thing had sneaked around the other side and caught the last sailor and killed him before he had time to yell even once. I told Ferguson that as far as I was concerned, I had had just enough. The best thing we could do was to get that engine started if we could and get away from there before we died like the other 6. He asked me to stay just one more night and try the dummy bait again. If nothing happened then, he promised to leave the next morning. I did not like the idea and told him so, but finally I gave in to him. We worked on the engine that day and found it was in perfect condition. He knew a good deal about machinery and showed me just how to start it and run it in case, he said, anything happened to him the next night. But he promised to stay shut in his cabin and not come out till he heard me start the machine gun. How about that beer? I ordered it for him, and he drank it slowly. Then he continued his story. I was rather sure by this time that the whole thing was a clever lie, but I wanted to know how he was going to finish it. Toward dusk, I put some bacon on the dummy to make him smell better, and then I started to do some tall thinking. There was no moon and not much starlight. That animal, Kraken or whatever you want to call it, was smart. What he would likely do was to recognize the fact that the dummy was just so much bait, and he would sneak up in back of me and take me instead of the bait. The thing to do was to turn the machine gun around the other way. Then, when he came for me, I would start firing. I would be standing looking at the bait, but at the least noise I would swing around and get the gun working. And there in the darkness I waited, and waited, glad that Ferguson was safe in his cabin. And then, just when I felt I simply could not wait any longer, I heard a little swishing sound in back of me. I jumped around and started that damned gun squirting. And then what happened? I asked. I stopped the gun and waited. Not a sound. Everything was as black as it could be, except for the lantern up by the dummy. I did not have the least idea whether I had hit that monster or only frightened it. I guess I didn't care very much. Here is the peculiar part. I've been through all kinds of hell in my life, and it never fazed me. But this time I was sick, and I wanted to see Ferguson. It was not the boss especially, just anyone I could talk to. I felt my way down to his cabin. He had a light burning, but he wasn't there. Gone. And I was feeling so low that I just locked the door and threw myself down on his bunk. Man, but I felt sick. I suppose Ferguson decided to go up on deck during the night and the beast grabbed him? I asked. That was the way I figured it out. Anyway, I stayed there till morning, and then I went on deck. Thought I would have a look around and see if I'd hit that sea thing and then start the engine and get out if I could. All I could think of was to get away as soon as I could. Can I have another beer? You certainly can. Now, when you went on deck with the sun shining, what did you find? He drank the beer slowly, and then even more slowly said in a whisper, I found Ferguson, just about cut in two by the bullets. You killed him instead of the monster? Just that. Got jitters and fired at the first noise in back of me, and I guess he never knew what hit him. It was a mess. And now to the end of this story. I managed to start the engine and raise a few sails, though it took me a long time. But I got out of there and sailed east, and when I got in sight of the Azores, I set the ship afire and went ashore in a boat. Of course, there was an investigation.
But I just answered questions and did not tell the whole story. So finally I was allowed to leave and took the first tramp steamer back to America. And so you never saw the Kraken? No, and I do not think there ever was one. What makes you say that? I asked sharply. You say those men disappeared. If it wasn't a sea monster, what was it? Ferguson. I know you are lying now. Knew you would think so. Never told the story to anyone before because I knew no one would believe me. But Ferguson was a real scientist. He wanted to devote his life to a study of those little animals in the floating seaweed. He knew that no one would willingly stay there month after month with him, but he had to have a crew to get him there. He took me and the gun along to cover up his crime. How do you know that? You are practically saying that he killed the men. Am I? Well, I have reason to think so. Why? Because he kept a daily record of everything he did, and I found that book in his cabin. He would sneak up behind those men, crush their skulls with a blackjack, tie some lead to their feet, and throw them overboard. He did that to the cook when he went out to see why he was late with the meal, and he was going to do it to me, only I outsmarted him. The man must have been insane. Sure of all this? Better than sure. He had the blackjack in his hand and his hand up ready to strike when the bullets hit him. Now, do I get a night's lodging on that story?
The Thing in the Cellar. It was a large cellar, entirely out of proportion to the house above it. The owner admitted that it was probably built for a distinctly different kind of structure from the one which rose above it. Probably the first house had been burned, and poverty had caused a diminution of the dwelling erected to take its place. A winding stone stairway connected the cellar with the kitchen. Around the base of this series of steps, successive owners of the house had placed their firewood, winter vegetables, and junk. The junk had gradually been pushed back till it rose, head high, in a barricade of uselessness. What was back of that barricade, no one knew and no one cared. For some hundreds of years no one had crossed it to penetrate to the black reaches of the cellar behind it. At the top of the steps, separating the kitchen from the cellar, was a stout oaken door. This door was, in a way, as peculiar and out of relation to the rest of the house as the cellar. It was a strange kind of door to find in a modern house, and certainly a most unusual door to find in the inside of the house. Thick, stoutly built, dexterously rabbited together, with huge wrought-iron hinges, and a lock that looked as though it came from Castle Despair. Separating a house from the outside world, such a door would be excusable. Swinging between kitchen and cellar, it seemed peculiarly inappropriate. From the earliest months of his life, Tommy Tucker seemed unhappy in the kitchen. In the front parlor, in the formal dining room, and especially on the second floor of the house, he acted like a normal, healthy child. But carry him to the kitchen, he at once began to cry. His parents, being plain people, ate in the kitchen save when they had company. Being poor, Mrs. Tucker did most of her work, though occasionally she had a charwoman in to do the extra Saturday cleaning, and thus much of her time was spent in the kitchen. And Tommy stayed with her, at least as long as he was unable to walk. Much of the time he was decidedly unhappy. When Tommy learned to creep, he lost no time in leaving the kitchen. No sooner was his mother's back turned than the little fellow crawled as fast as he could for the doorway opening into the front of the house, the dining room, and the front parlor. Once away from the kitchen, he seemed happy. At least he ceased to cry. On being returned to the kitchen, his howl so thoroughly convinced the neighbors that he had colic that more than one bowl of catnip and sage tea was brought to his assistance. It was not until the boy learned to talk that the Tuckers had any idea as to what made the boy cry so hard when he was in the kitchen. In other words, the baby had to suffer for many months till he obtained at least a little relief,
and even when he told his parents what was the matter, they were absolutely unable to comprehend. This is not to be wondered at, because they were both hard-working, rather simple-minded persons. What they finally learned from their little son was this, that if the cellar door was shut and securely fastened with a heavy iron lock, Tommy could at least eat a meal in peace. If the door was simply closed and not locked, he shivered with fear, but kept quiet. But if the door was open, if even the slightest streak of black showed that it was not tightly shut, then the little 3-year-old would scream himself to the point of exhaustion, especially if his tired father would refuse him permission to leave the kitchen. Playing in the kitchen, the child developed 2 interesting habits. Rags, scraps of paper, and splinters of wood were continually being shoved under the thick oak door to fill the space between the door and the sill. Whenever Mrs. Tucker opened the door, there was always some trash there, placed by her son. It annoyed her, and more than once the little fellow was thrashed for this conduct. But punishment acted in no way as a deterrent. The other habit was as singular. Once the door was closed and locked, he would rather boldly walk over to it and caress the old lock. Even when he was so small that he had to stand on tiptoe to touch it with the tips of his fingers, he would touch it with slow, caressing strokes. Later on, as he grew, he used to kiss it. His father, who only saw the boy at the end of the day, decided that there was no sense in such conduct, and in his masculine way tried to break the lad of his foolishness. There was, of necessity, no effort on the part of the hard-working man to understand the psychology back of his son's conduct. All that the man knew was that his little son was acting in a way that was decidedly queer. Tommy loved his mother and was willing to do anything he could to help her in the household chores, but one thing he would not do, and never did do, and that was to fetch and carry between the house and the cellar. If his mother opened the door, he would run screaming from the room, and he never returned voluntarily till he was assured that the door was closed. He never explained just why he acted as he did. In fact, he refused to talk about it, at least to his parents, and that was just as well, because had he done so, they would simply have been more positive than ever that there was something wrong with their only child. They tried, in their own ways, to break the child of his unusual habits. Failing to change him at all, they decided to ignore his peculiarities. That is, they ignored them till he became 6 years old, and the time came for him to go to school. He was a sturdy little chap by that time, and more intelligent than the usual boys beginning in the primer class. Mr. Tucker was, at times, proud of him. The child's attitude toward the cellar door was the one thing most disturbing to the father's pride. Finally, nothing would do but that the Tucker family call on the neighborhood physician. It was an important event in the life of the Tuckers, so important that it demanded the wearing of Sunday clothes and all that sort of thing. "The matter is just this, Dr. Hawthorne," said Mr. Tucker in a somewhat embarrassed manner. "Our little Tommy is old enough to start to school, but he behaves childish in regard to our cellar, and the missus and I thought you could tell us how to do about it. It must be his nerves. Ever since he was a baby," continued Mrs. Tucker, taking up the thread of conversation where her husband had paused, "Tommy has had a great fear of the cellar. Even now, big boy that he is, he does not love me enough to fetch and carry for me through that door and down those steps. It is not natural for a child to act like he does. And what with chinking the cracks with rags and kissing the lock, he drives me to the point where I fear he may become daft-like as he grows older." The doctor, eager to satisfy new customers and dimly remembering some lectures on the nervous system received when he was a medical student, asked some general questions, listened to the boy's heart, examined his lungs, and looked at his eyes and fingernails. At last he commented, "Looks like a fine, healthy boy to me." "Yes, all except the cellar door," replied the father. "Has he ever been sick?" "Naught but fits once or twice when he cried himself blue in the face," answered the mother. "Frightened? Perhaps. It was always in the kitchen. Suppose you go out and let me talk to Tommy by myself." And there sat the doctor, very much at his ease, and the little 6-year-old boy very uneasy. "Tommy, what is there in the cellar you're afraid of?" "I don't know." "Have you ever seen it?" "No, sir." "Ever heard it? Smelt it?" "No, sir." Then how do you know there is something there? Because. Because what? Because there is. That was as far as Tommy would go, and at last his seeming obstinacy annoyed the physician even as it had for several years annoyed Mr. Tucker. He went to the door and called the parents into the office. He thinks there is something down in the cellar, he stated. The Tuckers simply looked at each other. That's foolish, commented Mr. Tucker. 'Tis just a plain cellar with junk and firewood and cider barrels in it, added Mrs. Tucker. Since we moved into that house, I have not missed a day without going down those stone steps, and I know there is nothing there. But the lad has always screamed when the door was open. I recall now that since he was a child in arms, he has always screamed when the door was open. He thinks there is something there, said the doctor. That is why we brought him to you, replied the father. It's the child's nerves. Perhaps Fatida or something will calm him. I tell you what to do, advised the doctor. He thinks there is something there. Just as soon as he finds that he is wrong, and that there is nothing there, he will forget about it. He has been humoured too much. What you want to do is to open that cellar door and make him stay by himself in the kitchen. Nail the door open so he cannot close it. Leave him alone there for an hour, and then go and laugh at him, and show him how silly it was for him to be afraid of an empty cellar. I will give you some nerve and blood tonic, and that will help, but the big thing is to show him that there is nothing to be afraid of. On the way back to the Tucker home, Tommy broke away from his parents. They caught him after an exciting chase and kept him between them the rest of the way home. Once in the house, he disappeared and was found in the guest room under the bed. The afternoon being already spoiled for Mr. Tucker, he determined to keep the child under observation for the rest of the day. Tommy ate no supper, in spite of the urgings of the unhappy mother. The dishes were washed, the evening paper read, the evening pipe smoked, and then, and only then, did Mr. Tucker take down his toolbox and get out a hammer and some long nails. And I am going to nail the door open, Tommy, so you cannot close it, as that was what the doctor said, Tommy. And you are to be a man and stay here in the kitchen alone for an hour, and we will leave the lamp a-burning. And then when you find there is naught to be afraid of, you will be well and a real man, and not something for a man to be ashamed of being the father of. But at the last Mrs. Tucker kissed Tommy, and cried and whispered to her husband not to do it, and to wait till the boy was larger. But nothing was to do except to nail the thick door open so it could not be shut, and leave the boy there alone with the lamp burning, and the dark open space of the doorway to look at, with eyes that grew as hot and burning as the flame of the lamp. That same day, Dr. Hawthorne took supper with a classmate of his, a man who specialized in psychiatry, and who was particularly interested in children. Hawthorne told Johnson about his newest case, the little Tucker boy, and asked him for his opinion. Johnson frowned. Children are odd, Hawthorne. Perhaps they're like dogs. It may be their nervous system is more acute than in the adult. We know that our eyesight is limited, also our hearing and smell. I firmly believe that there are forms of life which exist in such a form that we can neither see, hear, nor smell them. Fondly, we delude ourselves into the fallacy of believing that they do not exist because we cannot prove their existence. This Tucker lad may have a nervous system that is particularly acute. He may dimly appreciate the existence of something in the cellar which is unappreciable to his parents. Evidently, there is some basis to this fear of his. Now, I'm not saying that there is anything in the cellar. In fact, I suppose that it is just an ordinary cellar. But this boy, since he was a baby, has thought that there was something there, and that is just as bad as though there actually were. What I would like to know is what makes him think so. Give me the address, and I will call tomorrow and have a talk with the little fellow. What do you think of my advice? Sorry, old man, but I think it was perfectly rotten. If I were you, I would stop around there on my way home and prevent them from following it. The little fellow may be badly frightened. You see, he evidently thinks there is something there. But there isn't. Perhaps not. No doubt he is wrong, but he thinks so. It all worried Dr. Hawthorne so much that he decided to take his friend's advice. It was a cold night, a foggy night, and the physician felt cold as he tramped along the London streets. At last, he came to the Tucker house. He remembered now that he had been there once before, long ago, when little Tommy Tucker came into the world. There was a light in the front window, and in no time at all Mr. Tucker came to the door. "I have come to see Tommy," said the doctor. "He is back in the kitchen," replied the father. "He gave one cry, but since then he has been quiet," sobbed the wife. "If I had let her have her way, she would have opened the door, but I said to her, 'Mother, now is the time to make a man out of our Tommy.' And I guess he knows by now that there was naught to be afraid of. Well, the hour is up. Suppose we go and get him and put him to bed." "It has been a hard time for the little child," whispered the wife. Carrying the candle, the man walked ahead of the woman and the doctor, and at last opened the kitchen door. The room was dark. "Lamp has gone out," said the man. "Wait till I light it." "Tommy! Tommy!" called Mrs. Tucker. But the doctor ran to where a white form was stretched on the floor. Sharply he called for more light. Trembling, he examined all that was left of little Tommy. Twitching, he looked into the open space, down into the cellar. At last he looked at Tucker and Tucker's wife. Tommy has been hurt. I guess he is dead," he stammered. The mother threw herself on the floor and picked up the torn, mutilated thing that had been, only a little while ago, her little Tommy. The man took his hammer and drew out the nails and closed the door and locked it, and then drove in a long spike to reinforce the lock. Then he took hold of the doctor's shoulders and shook him. "What killed him, doctor? What killed him?" he shouted into Hawthorne's ear. The doctor looked at him bravely, in spite of the fear in his throat. "How do I know, Tucker?" he replied. "How do I know? Didn't you tell me that there was nothing there? Nothing down there? In the cellar?" The Jellyfish. All space is relative. There is no such thing as size. The telescope and the microscope have produced a deadly levelling of great and small, far and near. The only little thing is sin. The only great thing is fear. For the 100th time, Professor Quirling repeated his statement, and for the 100th time we listened to him in silence, afraid to enter into a controversy with him. It was not the fact that he knew more than we did that kept us quiet, but it was the haunting fear that filled us when we listened to him or watched him at his work. Working at an unsolved problem, he seemed a soul detached, a spirit separated from its earthly home, a being living only in the realm of thought. Motionless, his body sat catatonic. His eyes stared, unwinking, till his mind, satisfied, condescended to return to its bone-bound cell. Then, in magnificent condescension, he would talk in long, limpid language of the things that he had considered and the conclusions that he had deduced. We, chosen scientists, university graduates, hailed him as our master, and hated him for admitting the mastery. We hoped that some evil would befall him, and yet we realized that the success of the expedition depended upon his continued leadership. It was necessary for our future fame. We were struggling young men with all of life ahead of us, and if we failed in our first effort, there would be no other opportunities granted us. In a specially constructed yacht, a floating laboratory, we were south of Borneo, making a detailed study of the microscopic sea life. In deep sea nets, we gathered the tiny organisms, and then with microscope, photography, and the cinema, we observed them for the future instruction of the human race. There were hundreds of species, thousands of varieties, each to be identified, classified, described, studied, and photographed. We gathered in the morning, studied till midnight, and restlessly slept till morning. The only thing in which we agreed was ambition. Our solitary united emotion was a dreaded hatred of the professor. He knew how we felt, and enjoyed taunting us. I am your leader because I willed it, he would whisper to us. The will to attain with me is synonymous with the accomplishment of my desire. I believe in myself, and through this belief I succeed. There is nothing that a strong man cannot do if he wills to do it and believes in his strength. Our ideas of space, size, and time are but the fanciful dreams of children. I am 59 inches tall, and with my clothes weigh 110 pounds. If I desired, I could make myself a colossus and swallow the earth as a child swallows a pill. If I willed it, I could fly through space like a comet, or hang suspended in the ether like a morning star. My will is greater than any physical force because I believe in it. I have confidence in my own ability to do whatever I wish. So far, I have conducted myself like an average man because of my desire, not on account of my limitations. Man has a soul, and that ethereal force is greater than any law of nature that he ever thought of, or of any that God ever created. He is purely and totally supreme, if he so desires. It was after such a challenge to us and the universe that our chemist, Bullard, gathered courage to challenge his power. He stated his opinion sharply and to the point. I do not believe you. What is that to me? Answered the professor. Simply this. You make a statement of certain powers that you have. I say that it is not true. Of what good is it to boast if you know that we think you a liar? Can you do these things? If you can, do them for us, and I for one will call you greater than God. Fail to do them, and I brand you as a boasting liar. The professor looked at the chemist, and we, breathlessly, waited for the blow to fall. But he only laughed. You want a sign? A proof? I have thought of just a thing, and I would have proposed it myself had one of you not asked for it. The thing must be visible to you all, something that I can demonstrate, a thing unheard of, a thing thought by all men to be impossible, and yet I will do it. Listen to me. You have all seen the jellyfish, called the bishop's mitre. When it is magnified 300 times under the microscope, it looks like a small balloon with a large opening at one end. It propels its way through the water by the flagellate movement of its cilia. The walls are translucent and transparent. At the top there are two specialized groups of nerve cells which we believe may serve as eyes. The opening at the bottom serves as a mouth. Smaller cells enter there and are absorbed. I describe it to refresh your memory, though all of you have seen it. I will secure one in a hanging drop under the microscope, and then we will attach the camera and cinema to it. We will project the picture on our screen. You will see the mitre move and live. You will observe the cilia move. While we have the actual specimen under observation, I will look at it through the microscope. Then I will demonstrate to you that I am not the idle boaster that you think I am. I will perform an experiment that will win for me the name of the greatest scientist that has ever lived. When he had told us the nature of it, we were too much astonished to reply. It seemed evident that the man had become insane. He smiled at us as though we were children. After waiting for an answer and seeing that we had none to give, he began to prepare the apparatus for the experiment. Finally, all was to his satisfaction. After examining several drops of water from our specimen jar, he was able to imprison a bishop's mitre in the hanging drop under the microscope. He turned on the electricity, and we saw the jellyfish move upon the screen. The professor carefully adjusted the apparatus till the organism appeared with more than usual distinctness. We saw the little animal that he had so carefully described to us. We even saw the little projections, which we believed were rudimentary visual organs. Then Professor Quirling told the cinema operator what he wanted done. He was to take a picture, starting from the time the professor disappeared down the brass tube of the microscope, and continuing till he reappeared. No matter what happened, he was to go on taking pictures. "It is all well enough," said our master. for you children to see what is happening, to talk about it later. But who would believe you? We know that the camera cannot lie. That is why it is important to take a consecutive picture of what occurs. Otherwise, you might think that I have been able to hypnotize you. Now, I will look down this tube. I see at the bottom in the hanging drop a transparent balloon. It is a pretty sight. Watch me carefully, as I will myself to shrink. I will go on talking as long as I can, and you must listen carefully, because the smaller I am, the less audible will be my voice. Now I am 12 inches high. I am standing near the microscope. I become still smaller, and now I am only 1 inch tall, and am standing on the eyepiece. No doubt you can barely hear me. Now I am smaller yet, and am ready to will myself through the glass of the eyepiece. The room was silent. We looked, shivering, at the microscope, and the professor was gone. The chemist staggered over to the instrument, looked into it, and silently staggered back to his seat. On the screen in front of us, the inhabitants of the drop of water lived and moved, and had their being. Largest of all was the transparent jellyfish, which was moving restlessly as though seeking a way of escape. The only sound in the room was the whir of the cinema and the harsh breathing of the chemist. Then, on the screen came a new figure, and we were able to identify the professor swimming among the infusoria. Gaining his balance, he at last stood upright and waved his hand at us. It was easy to see his smile, that condescending smile that had so often driven us frantic. There was no doubt from the expression on his face that he was highly pleased with his performance. None of us dared look at his fellow. Not one of the audience thought for a second of taking his eyes off the silver screen. We were stunned, stupefied, and filled with a wild terror, all the more horrible because of its silence. The professor started to swim again, and now approached the jellyfish. He tapped the crystal walls. Then, as though seized with a sudden impulse, he went to the bottom, jumped up through the mouth, and entered the translucent ball of protoplasm. He peered at us through the transparent walls. His arms made a series of peculiar movements, and once again he smiled at us. "My God!" exclaimed the artist. "He is wig-wagging to us in the army code. He said, 'I have done it, and now I will return to your world.'" And, as though beginning to keep his promise, he started for the mouth of the jellyfish. And then, the mouth closed. The professor circled the glass-like ball, seeking a way of exit. Once he waved at us in a peculiar manner, and then, suddenly, he sought the wall and, with arms and legs, tried to break through. On his face was now the look of ghastly despair. The things on top of the jellyfish began to glow. No doubt now that they were eyes, and bright ones. Before us, the professor slowly disappeared into a globule of milky protoplasm. The jellyfish not only had made him a prisoner, but had actually dissolved and digested him. With a shriek, the artist went over to the wall and turned on the electric lights. Trembling, the chemist looked down the tube of the microscope and told us that there was nothing in the hanging drop, save the jellyfish.
The Dead Woman. He was found in the room with his wife, slightly confused, a trifle bewildered, but otherwise apparently normal. He made no effort to conceal his conduct any more than he did to the knife in his hand or the pieces in the trunk. Fortunately, the inspector was an officer of more than usual intelligence, and there was no effort made to give the third degree or even secure a written confession. Perhaps the police department felt it was too plain a case. At least it was handled intelligently and in a most scientific manner. The man was well fed, carefully bedded, and the next morning, after being bathed and shaved, was taken to see a psychiatrist. The specialist in mental diseases had the man comfortably seated. Knowing he smoked, he offered a cigar, which was accepted. Then, in a quiet, pleasant atmosphere, he made one statement and one request. "I am sure, Mr. Thompson, that you had an excellent reason for acting as you did the other day. I wish you would tell me all about it." The man gazed at the psychiatrist. "Will you believe me if I tell you? I will accept every part of your story with the idea that you are convinced that you are telling me the truth." "That is all I want," whispered Thompson. "If everyone I talked to in the past had done that, if they'd even tried to check up on my story, perhaps this would not have happened. But they always thought that I was the sick one, and there was not one who was willing to accept my statement about the worms. I suppose that I was happily married, at least as much so as most men are. You know that there is a good deal of conflict between the sexes, and there were a few differences of opinion between Mrs. Thompson and myself, but not enough to cause serious difficulty. Will you remember that we did not quarrel very much? About a year ago, my wife's health began to give me considerable cause for worry. She started to fail. If you're a married man, Doctor, you know there is always that anxiety about the wife's health. You become accustomed to living with a woman, having her do things for you, go to places with you, and you think about how life would be if she should sicken and die. Perhaps the fact that you're uneasy about the future makes you exaggerate the importance of her symptoms. At any rate, she became sick, developed a nasty cough, and lost weight. I spoke to her about it, and even bought a bottle of beef, wine, and iron at the drugstore, and made her take it. She did so to please me, but she never would admit that she was sick. Said it was fashionable to be thin, and that the cough was just nervousness. She would not go to see a doctor. When I spoke to her mother about it, the old lady just laughed at me, said that if I tried to make Lizzie a little happier, she would soon get fat. In fact, none of our family or our friends seemed to feel that there was anything wrong with Mrs. Thompson, so I stopped talking about it. Of course, it was not easy on me, the way she coughed at night and her staying awake so much. I work hard in the daytime, and it's hard to lose a lot of sleep. At last, I was forced to ask her to let me sleep in the spare bedroom. Even that did not help much. I could hear her cough, and when she did fall asleep, I would have to tiptoe into her room and see if she was all right. Her coughing bothered me so much that when she did not cough, it worried me more because I thought something had happened to her. One night, the thing I was afraid of happened. She had a hard spell of coughing, and then she stopped. It was quiet in the house. I could hear the clock on the landing tick, and a mouse gnawing wood in the attic. I thought I could even hear my own heartbeat, but there was not a sound of any kind from the other bedroom. When I went in there and turned on the light, I just knew it was all over. Of course, I was not sure. A bookkeeper is not supposed to be an expert in such matters, so I went and telephoned for our doctor. On the way to the phone, I wondered just what I should say, for he'd always insisted that my wife was in grand health. So I simply told him that Mrs. Thompson was not looking well, and would he come over? Just like that, I told him, and tried to keep my voice steady. It was about an hour before he came. He went into the bedroom, but I stopped at the doorway. He spent some time listening to her heart and feeling her pulse, and then he straightened up and said to me, "She is fine, just fast asleep. I wish I could sleep as soundly as that. What did you think was wrong?" That surprised me so much that all I could do was to stammer something about not hearing her cough any more. He laughed. "You worry too much about her, Mr. Thompson." Right there my difficulty started. Here was a doctor who was supposed to know his business, and he said there was nothing wrong with my wife. And there I was, just a bookkeeper, and I just knew what was the matter. What was I to do? Tell him he was wrong? Send for another physician? It was growing light by that time, so I went down to the kitchen and started the coffee. I often did that. Then I shaved and made ready to go to the office. But before I went, I sat down a while by the wife's bed. It bothered me, but I had to keep telling myself that the doctor knew better than I did. Before leaving the house, I phoned to my mother-in-law. Just told her that Lizzie was not feeling well, and would she come over and spend the day, and she could get me at the office any time she called. Then I left the house. It felt better out in the sunshine, and after working a few hours over the books, I almost laughed at myself for being so foolish. No telephone calls from the old lady. I arrived home at 6 and found the house lighted as usual. My wife and mother-in-law were waiting for me in the parlour and told me supper was ready. Naturally, I was surprised to see my wife out of bed. At the supper table, I watched her just as carefully as I could without making the two of them suspicious of me. Mrs. Thompson ate about as she usually did, just pieced and minced at her food, but I thought when she swallowed that the food went down with a jerk, and there was a stiffness when she moved. But her mother did not seem to think there was anything wrong. At least she did not make any comment. Even when I went with her to the front door to say good night to her, and we were alone there, she never said a word to show that she thought her daughter was peculiar. I started to wash the dishes after that. I often washed the dishes at night while the wife sat in the front parlour watching the people go up and down past the house. After the kitchen was tidy, I lit a cigar and went into the parlour and started a little conversation, but Mrs. Thompson never talked back. In fact, I do not believe she ever talked to me after that, though I am positive that she talked to the others. When the cigar was smoked, I just said good night and went to bed. Later, I could hear her moving around in her room, and then all was quiet, so she must have gone to bed. She did not cough any more. I congratulated myself on that one thing, because the coughing had kept me awake a good deal. During the night, I lit a candle, and, shading it with my hand, tiptoed in to see her. She had her eyes open, but they were rolled back, so all you could see was the whites, and she was not breathing. At least I could not tell that she was breathing. And when I held a mirror in front of her mouth, there was no vapour on it. My mother had told me the purpose of that when I was a boy. The next day was just the same. My mother-in-law came and spent the day. I came home at night and ate supper with them and washed the dishes. The water was hot, and it was a pleasure to make them clean. Perhaps I took longer than usual at it, because I did not fancy the idea of going into the front parlour, where the wife was sitting looking out of the window. But I went in, tonight without the usual cigar. I wanted to use my nose. It seemed there was a peculiar odour in the house, like flowers that had been put in a vase of water and then forgotten for many days. Perhaps you know the odour, Doctor. A heavy one, like lilies of the valley in a small closed room. It was specially strong in the parlour, where Mrs. Thompson was sitting, and it seemed to come from her. I had to light the cigar after a while, and by and by I said good night and went to bed. She never spoke to me. In fact, she did not seem to pay any attention to me. About 2 that morning, I took the candle and went in to look at her. Her eyelids were open, and her eyeballs were rolled back just like they had been the night before, but now her jaw was dropped and her cheeks sunk in. I just could not do anything but telephone for a doctor. And this time I picked out a total stranger, just picked his name out of the telephone book haphazard. What good did it do? None at all. He came, he examined Mrs. Thompson very carefully, and he simply said that he did not see anything wrong with her. And then down in the front hall he turned on me and asked me just why I'd sent for him and what I thought was the matter with her. Of course, I just could not tell him the truth, with his being a doctor and I being just a bookkeeper. My mother-in-law went to the mountains next day for the summer, and that left us alone. Breakfast as usual, and to the office, and not a word all day from the house. When I came back at night, the house was lit and supper was on the table, and the wife at her end as usual, and the food served and on the plates. She ate, but her movements were slower, and when she swallowed, you could see the food go down by jerks, and her eyes were sunken into the sockets and seemed shiny and, well, like the eyes of a fish on the stalls. There were flowers on the table, but the smell was something different. It was sweeter, and when I took a deep breath, it was just hard for me to go on eating the pork chops and potatoes. You see, it was summertime and warm, and in spite of the screens, there was a fly or two in the house, and when I saw one walking around on her lip and she not making any effort to brush it off, I just couldn't keep on eating. Had to go and start washing the dishes. Perhaps you can understand how I felt, Doctor. Things looked rather odd. The next day I phoned to the office that I would not be there, and I sent for a taxi and took Mrs. Thompson to a first-class specialist. He must have been good, because he charged me $25 just for the office call. I went in first and told him just exactly what I was afraid of, and I did not mince my words, and then we had the wife in. He examined her, even her blood, and all the satisfaction I got was that she seemed a trifle anemic, but that I had better take a nerve tonic and a vacation, or I would be sick. Things looked rather twisted after that. Either I was right and everybody else wrong, or they were right and I was just about as wrong mentally as a man could be. But I had to believe my senses. A man just has to believe what he sees and hears and feels. And when I thought over that office visit and the wife smiling and the doctor sticking her finger for the blood to examine, it just seemed impossible. Anemic! Why, that was a simple word to describe her condition. That night the flies were worse than usual. I went to the corner store and bought a fly spray and used it in her bedroom, but they kept coming in, the big blue ones, you know. Seemed as though they just had to come in, and I could not keep them off her face. So at last, in desperation, I covered her head up with a towel and went to sleep. I had to work. The interest on the mortgage was due, and the man wanted something on the principal, and it was a good house and all I had in the world to show for 20 years of hard work keeping books. The next day was just like all the days had been, except that I made more mistakes with the books, and my boss spoke to me about it. And when I arrived home, supper was not ready, though Mrs. Thompson was in the parlour and the lights on. The heavy odour was worse than usual, and there were a lot of flies. You could hear them buzz and strike against the electric lights. I got my own supper, but I couldn't eat much, thinking of her in the parlour and the flies settling on her open mouth. She just sat there that night in the parlour till I went to her and took her arm to lead her up the stairs. She was cold, and on each cheek there was a heavy purple blotch forming. Once she was in her room, she seemed to move around, so I left her alone, and when I went into her room later on, she was in bed. It had been a hard week for me, so I sat down by her bed and tried to think, but the more I thought, the worse things seemed. The night was hot, and the flies kept buzzing. Just thinking of the past and how we used to go to the movies together and laugh and sometimes come near crying, and how we used to bluff about the fact that perhaps it was just as well we didn't have a child so long as we had each other, knowing all the time that she was eating her heart out for longing to be a mother and blaming me for her loneliness. The thinking was too much for me, so I thought I might as well smoke another cigar and go to bed and try to keep better books the next day and hold my job. And then I saw the little worm crawl out. Right then and there I knew that something had to be done. It didn't make any difference what the doctors or her mother said. Something had to be done, and I was the one who had to do it. I telephoned for an undertaker. Met him downstairs. It will be a private funeral, I told him, and no publicity, and I think after you're through you will have no trouble obtaining a physician's certificate. He went upstairs. In about 5 minutes he came downstairs. I must have gone to the wrong room, he said. The second-story front bedroom, I replied. But the woman there is not dead, he said. I paid him for his trouble and shut the door in his face. Was I helpless? Doctor, you have to believe me. I was at the end of my rope. I had tried every way I knew, and there was not anything left to do. No one believed me. No one agreed with me. It seemed more and more as though they thought I was insane. It was impossible to keep her in the house longer. My health was giving way. Working all day at figures that were going wrong all the time, and coming back night after night, cooking my supper and sleeping in a room next to the thing that had been my wife. What with the smell of lilies of the valley and the buzz of flies and the constant dread in my mind of how things would be the next day and the next week and the mortgage due, I had to do something. And it seemed to me that she wanted me to. It seemed that she recognized that things were not right, that she was entitled to a different kind of an ending. I tried to put myself in her place, and I knew what I would want done with me if things were reversed. So I brought the trunk up from the cellar. We had used that trunk on our wedding trip and every summer since on our vacations, and I thought that she would be more at peace in that trunk than in a new one. But when I had the trunk by her bed, I saw at once that it was too small, unless I used a knife. That seemed to be the proper thing to do, and I was sure that it would not hurt her. For days she had been past hurting. I told her I was sorry, but it just had to be done, and if people had just believed me, things could have been arranged in a nicer way. Then I started. Things were confused after that. I seemed to remember a scream and blood spurting, and the next thing there were a lot of people in the house, and they arrested me. And that is the peculiar part of it all, Doctor. Perhaps you do not know it, but I am accused of murdering my wife. Now, I have told you all about it, Doctor, and I just want to ask you one question. If you had been in my place day after day and night after night, what would you have done, Doctor? What would any man have done who loved his wife?
If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time.